Hi, thanks for joining me today. In this video, I want to show you some ways that you can adapt or modify some yoga poses to make them more accessible for you. So maybe you're recovering from an injury, or maybe you just have some issues that make the traditional yoga poses a little bit more challenging for you. And so I wanted to use this video to give you some ways to help you make those poses a little bit more accessible, and that way you can take these ideas and use them in any of my other videos on my YouTube channel. So you will need today preferably a folded up blanket, or even a couple of towels, like a couple of beach towels or bath towels folded up so you have something to sit up on. If you have yoga blocks, have 2 yoga blocks. If you don't, you can take a few sturdy books, stack them up, tie them together so they have kind of this shape, and a sturdy chair. I have a metal chair here, but you can use a wooden kitchen chair or dining room chair that is sturdy and preferably doesn't have any arms on the side. So we're going to start, as we do most yoga poses, start in some type of a seated position. If sitting in a cross-legged position is not comfortable for you, a couple of ways you can adapt that. If you have, for example, if you have a knee that you have a problem with, you can always straighten that leg out in your seated position. If both of your knees are issues for you, you can straighten both of your legs out. It's always helpful to sit up on a little blanket or cushion, and I'll demonstrate why for that reason. So usually, not always, but a lot of times we don't have the hip mobility and the core strength to sit up straight in a seated position. We have a tendency to end up here, and if you were doing that modification with the legs straight, you might find yourself kind of slumping and rounding. If you have a blanket or a cushion to sit up on, you can help have that lift your hips up a little bit so you find a more neutral position in your seated posture. Same alignment you would want in the saddle if you're in equestrian, and same thing, you can use that same idea of sitting up on the blanket with the legs extended out. If that is not quite enough height for you, the next variation is to take those blocks or those few books that you have tied together and place those underneath. And I'll show you from both sides. I'll show you from the side first. So if I set up a little higher, you can see again that helps my knees to drop down, my hips to open up a little bit, and it's easier to get into that nice neutral position. And again, same thing from the front. You can see that this can help a lot. If when you sit you feel really tight and your hips are here, it can help lifting the hips up a little bit to get the legs to release down a little bit. So that is same thing with the legs extended out. So that is the variation that you can do. If none of those things work for you in a seated position, the next variation is to just simply sit in a chair. So you can have that nice position. You want to think of the legs being, thighs being parallel to the mat. So if your knees are way up here, then if you're tall, then maybe you sit up on a blanket so that, again, that you can bring those knees, thighs parallel to the ground. If you're very petite and you find that your feet aren't reaching the ground, you can take that same blanket or your blocks and let your feet rest on the blocks. This chair happens to be the perfect height for me, but that same thing, you want to find that nice neutral position in the spine. So you can do all of your beginning warm up poses in a seated position on a chair or even on your couch, as long as you sit up nice and tall. Sometimes the couch, those nice soft cushy cushions kind of encourage us to slump. So you want to keep that nice lengthen your spine. So again, you can do the sun breath. We reach the arms up and overhead. We can do lateral flexion here, reaching up and over. Left side and right side. You can float the arms up and take a twist, reaching the hand behind. Again, all different variations, just seated in the chair if sitting down on the ground with, again, those different props, either your blanket and or your blocks. So that's a couple variations for sitting down on the ground or seated in your chair. So the next area that people tend to have a little difficulty with is a little pressure in the hands and the knees when they are down on all fours in table pose. So in table pose, we have the wrist under the shoulders and the knees under the hips. If you have difficulty with the knees on the ground, you can take that blanket or that folded up towel that you have, unfold it a little bit so it's not too thick. You want to keep stability here, but then you can rest those knees right on the blanket so that when you're doing your cow pose, your cat pose and your cow pose, you have that little extra support for the knees. And same thing in your lunge, as you step the right leg forward and come up, you have that padding underneath that back knee. Another variation for a lunge that you can do is hands resting on your blocks to give yourself a little bit of support. So again, that knee can come back, and then we can step that opposite leg forward. And again, using blocks to give us a little bit of support. And I'm always focusing on your breath. And then coming back down to that table pose, sometimes there are issues with the wrist. A couple different things you can do here. The first thing is just to make a fist with the hands and place the fist down on the ground so you take the bend out of the wrist. So again, we can do that cat and cow. Exhaling round to your cat pose, and then inhale, the pelvis tips forward, lift the heart and sternum, gaze forward and up into cow pose. So that's one variation. Another variation that you can do for the wrist is to actually bring the elbows down to the mat. So elbows underneath the shoulders, forearms parallel, and that same idea of that cat and the cow with the elbows resting on the mat. And then coming back to center. So downward facing dog. And again, this is one that sometimes gives people a lot of issues. So traditional downward facing dog, hands in front of the shoulders, curling the toes under, sit bones up and back into our downward facing dog here. And again, this can put a little bit of pressure on the wrist. You want to think of pressing into the fingertips and the base of the knuckles to help take the pressure off the wrist. You can always bend the knees to bring more length into the spine. A different variation is same thing we just did, is bringing those elbows down to the mat, interlacing the fingers, curling the toes under, send the sit bones up and back, and doing a variation of downward facing dog, actually called dolphin pose, to take the pressure off of the wrist. Of course, always nice breaths in and out. And then releasing the knees down. And we're going to fold back into a child pose. And this can be challenging for some people, first of all, because maybe the forehead doesn't come to the mat, so you can use one of your blocks or your stack of books, so you keep a neutral position in your spine here. And if your heels and your sit bones don't come close to each other, you can take this folded up blanket and place it on the backs of the legs, so that when you fold back into that child pose, you have a little bit more support for the hips. Again, different variations here. And you can try these along with me, of course.
and then pressing into the hands, come up to your table pose, and then just moving your props off to the side. So maybe none of those variations work for you. So we're gonna bring that chair back into our practice here. So if you're using a chair, you wanna make sure that the entire chair is on your mat so that it does not slide. And if you feel that it might slide, it's best to maybe slide your mat up to the edge of the wall. Like if I had space here, I would slide my mat all the way to the wall, and I would have the chair legs against the wall so I was sure that it would not slide. But again, little variation here. You can come into that table pose, nice long spine, wrists under the shoulders, feet now underneath the hips, and do your cat and cow here. So exhale, round to a cat pose. Inhale, the pelvis tips forward, lift the heart and the sternum, gaze forward and up into cow pose. So this is going to take, again, the pressure off the wrists and the knees here. So variation. And then come back to that neutral position. And we can take, again, a different variation of downward facing dog. Take your hands and kind of wrap the fingers just a little around the seat of the chair for a little bit more stability. Walk the feet back. Let the head release down, and you have a variation here of downward facing dog. And then for a little less of a variation, you can always rest your hands on the back of the chair and just find a nice length in your spine in this configuration. So again, different variations here to help make some of these poses a little bit more accessible for you. Then gently coming back up. Good. So I want to show you a couple variations that you can do seated. And again, we were talking about that lunge earlier and pressure in the knees. And if you do have some issues with the knees, a way that you can do a lunge in your chair is turning to the side, slide back a little bit so the back leg can drop down. You can keep the back toes curled under, or you can point the back toes. Half of your seat is going to be rested on the chair, so that really helps a little bit with core. And then you can bring the arms overhead here. So again, a variation of lunge. So back toes can be curled under. This actually is a little bit more stable. It's going to get this leg a little bit more active than the toes straight behind you. So you can do that variation. And you can try that lunge on the opposite side. Again, I've slid back just a little bit so that my knee is just, the bend of my knee is just a little bit in front of the seat of the chair. The back leg drops down. Find your alignment. So we want to make sure we're not dropping off to the side. And then bring those arms overhead. Or you can just rest the hands on the thighs, or you can rest one hand on the back of the chair and just reach one arm up. Again, many variations here. Inhale and exhale, and then gently release the hands down and come back to your seated position. Perfect. So one more little sequence here. So maybe you just need a little help with your balance in your standing poses. So you can have the chair. Actually, I'm going to do this a little bit this way so that my chair stays on the mat. But for example, if you're doing a little balancing pose, like tree pose, turning the knee out to the side and placing that foot on the inner calf or the thigh, you can hold on to the back of the chair. You could just reach one arm up. So that's a variation for a standing balance. Just keep hold of something. You can also do that with the wall too. And then if we do some warrior poses, we can step the feet nice and wide, keeping hold of the chair, turning one foot out, bending the knee. So we come into our warrior pose. Maybe again, we keep the one hand on the chair, reaching one arm out. Then you can take a peaceful warrior here, and then come back to center. Bring the hand to the chair, straighten the leg, turn the toes in, and then opposite toes turn out. Nice length in your spine. Again, you can practice this along with me. Bend that knee. Think of that knee tracking towards that second and third toe. Then keep hold of the chair. With the one hand, extend that left arm out. And again, you can do each. You can reach the left fingertips forward. So our focal point is tracking over that left middle finger. But then to get that stretch in the back arm too, you can bring that left hand back, keep that focal point extending out, reach the right arm behind you. And then gently bring that hand back in, straighten the leg, bring the toes back in, and then just heel toe the feet back in using, again, your chair for your mountain pose. So I hope that this gives you a few ideas. If you struggle a little bit with some of the postures, again, even if you have issues with your wrists or your knees, or maybe a little bit with your balance or tight hips, these are all modifications, variations that you can use to make the poses a little bit more accessible to you. And again, I encourage you to go through the other videos on my YouTube channel and try some of these variations to see how they work for you. And sometimes just using these variations, whether you need them or not, it just gives you a different experience in your yoga practice. So fun to try. So thanks so much for joining me today. Please check out Grey Horse Yoga in the info section below. I teach a online Zoom class every Wednesday, 6:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Would love to see you there. And I hope to see you sometime soon in the saddle or on the mat. Thanks. Bye-bye.